Welcome to another episode of Tech Videos. My name's Todd. In today's video, I'll be showing you how to work on and maintain your spider type marker. In this video, we'll cover the basic teardown as well as the rebuild. We'll go over some maintenance issues as well as some troubleshooting. And in the end, we'll talk about all the different upgrades you can do to your spider and how drastically they can improve the performance of your gun. With that said, let's get started. The first thing that we're going to do is remove the barrel. This will make working on the gun easier. The next thing we're going to do is remove the drop forward and tank adapter from the bottom of the grip frame. And now, to do this you may need to use an Allen key or perhaps even a Phillips head screwdriver, depending on what type of gun you have. You just want to loosen up whatever holds the tank adapter to the bottom of the grip frame. Next, we're going to remove the two screws that hold the trigger frame in place. And this is done by either using a 1/8 or 3 mm Allen wrench. Once you have the screws removed, you can remove the trigger frame from the body of the gun. To remove the internals, we need to remove the bolt retaining pin. And this is the pin that goes across the gun and holds the internals in place. On this particular gun, we need to remove the cotter pin. I'm just taking a pick here and going to remove that. And then you can push in on the rear velocity adjuster and remove the bolt retaining pin. Just slide that through the gun. Once you do that, you just want to gently release the internals and pull on the bolt to remove the bolt and hammer assembly. And now once I get the bolt about this far out of the gun, I pinch the bolt and hammer together so that I can keep them as one piece and just remove them from the body of the gun. Now that we've got the gun apart, it's important that you know what all the parts are named and what they do. The most important part is the hammer, or commonly referred to as striker. And you'll notice that the hammer has an O-ring. This O-ring is the most important O-ring on the entire gun. It's this O-ring that causes the gun to recock. If you're having recocking issues, the first place that I would check is this O-ring. It's likely that it's either torn or just needs lubrication. Behind the hammer we have the mainspring, and that's the spring that pushes the hammer forward with each shot. We also have the bumper O-ring, and that protects the velocity adjuster from the hammer with each shot. Inside the mainspring you have the spring guide, and that just makes sure that the spring stays straight while the spring is coiled. And above that we have the bolt. And the bolt is what directs the air to the back of the ball as well as pushes it forward in the breech. Next we're going to remove the valve. To do this we need to remove the vertical ASA adapter that's on the front part of the gun. This is held on by the one screw on the bottom of the gun. And this uses either a 1/8 inch or a 3mm Allen wrench. Once you have the screw removed, you'll notice that there's spring tension on the vertical ASA adapter. You just want to slowly remove it from the body of the gun. Now I'm going to show you the differences between a few of the different types of guns that are out there. Down here we have the one off the icon that we've been working on, and we've got the valve stem, the cup seal, and then the valve spring. And that directly links into our vertical ASA adapter. Here we have a piece off of a spider. We'll have the valve stem, the cup seal, the valve spring, but we also have one additional part. You'll notice that we also have the cup seal guide, and this is just a little flat metal piece that positions our cup seal correctly inside the valve. This piece goes in between the valve spring and the cup seal, and this piece just makes sure that the cup seal moves correctly inside the gun. Next, we're going to remove the valve retaining nut in the bottom of the gun. Typically this uses a flathead screwdriver. You just want to remove this nut so that we can remove the valve. Once you have the valve retaining nut removed, you want to take a wooden dowel or even the back of a wooden kitchen spoon and push the valve out the front of the gun. You want to make sure that you don't use anything metal like a screwdriver that may scratch the internals of the gun. But you just want to push gently on the valve and it should just pop out the end of the gun. So at this point we've removed all the internals from the gun, and now it's time to put it back together and clean up all the parts. Before we start putting the gun back together, it's a good idea to take a swab or maybe even some paper towel and run it through both the top and bottom chambers of the gun. This is just going to ensure that the gun is good and clean before we start putting it back together. The first thing that we need to do in the reassembly is reinstall the valve into the gun. And before we do this, you need to inspect the O-rings that are on the valve. And you'll notice that we also have a white O-ring and a black O-ring. These help you signify what direction to put the valve back into the gun. The black O-ring goes towards the back of the gun, and the white O-ring goes towards the front of the gun. Before you put the valve back into the gun, you want to make sure that you oil the O-rings. This is just going to help ensure that the gun holds a good seal when you gas the gun up. If for some reason one of these O-rings is not creating a good seal, you'll get a leak inside the gun and you'll be required to change out one of these two O-rings. With the valve lubricated, we can reinstall it back into the gun. But before you do this, you want to make sure that the holes are lined up correctly. Again, you want to make sure that the black O-ring is facing the back of the gun, and if you don't have the correct O-rings there and you're not sure what direction it goes in, the smaller hole goes towards the back of the gun and the larger hole is in the front of the gun. And you also want to look on either side of the valve. There should be a hole. There's a smaller hole on this side and a larger hole on this side. The larger hole goes towards the top of the gun. You just want to line up the valve so that when you install it, the hole in the valve lines up with the hole for the valve retaining nut. You just want to screw this back down inside the gun. And now when you screw this in, you don't need to screw this in too tight. It needs to be just a little bit more than flush with the body of the gun. If you screw that down in too far, it's going to rub on the valve stem and it's going to cause either low velocities or inconsistencies over the chronograph. Next, we're going to examine our cup seal. And the area that you want to look at is this area here, right around the valve stem. If this area has a large indentation or any imperfections, that may cause a leak inside the gun. If you have any problems with your cup seal, you can just unscrew it from the valve stem and install a new one. Now that you have the valve installed, it's time to reinstall the cup seal and valve spring. What I like to do is I like to assemble them first and then drop them down into the gun. It just makes getting the valve pin and cup seal in position much easier. If you're using a spider, then you need to assemble the cup seal with the cup seal guide and the valve spring, and you can drop that down in just the same way. But we're going to put our cup seal back in, and once you have the cup seal correctly in position and it's through the valve, you need to install your vertical ASA adapter. Before you install this part, you want to look at the two O-rings that are on your vertical ASA adapter, and you want to make sure that they've got a good coating of oil on them so that they make a good seal and that there's no cuts or nicks in the O-rings. But once you've done that, you can just push this back into the gun and the spring should line up with the ASA adapter and you can put your screw back in. And you just have to apply some pressure, and the screw should go in fairly easily. Next, we're going to reinstall our vertical adapter. This may be either a foregrip like we have here that's just a gas-through grip, or you may have a regulator in its place. You want to make sure that you have this O-ring at the top of this adapter well oiled, and you want to inspect it for any nicks or cuts. Once you have it oiled up, you can reinstall it back into the gun. The next piece that we're going to install is our grip frame. And I realize we're going a little bit out of order here, but I want you to know that to service the internals, you don't necessarily have to take the grip frame off. So we're going to put this back on first. But before we do, you just want to take a look at the sear and make sure that there's no damage to the sear and that it's still in good condition. And it's not a bad idea to wipe down the internals to remove whatever dirt or debris might be in there. And the last thing you could do is just apply a small amount of oil or lubricant to the sear. And that's going to make it easier for the sear to release the hammer. To reinstall the grip frame, you just set the grip frame back into position, lining up the holes so you can put your grip frame screws back into the body. Take your Allen key and just tighten up the screws. These screws need to be pretty tight. It's very easy for these screws to vibrate loose during play, and you always want to check these before you start a day of play, because most likely they'll have loosened the last time you played. Sometimes you can put Loctite on these to hold these more securely in place. If you do choose to use Loctite, I recommend using a blue Loctite. That's a serviceable type of Loctite, and you'll be able to get the screws out next time you go to service your gun. Next, we'll reinstall our drop forward and just reinstall the 2 screws that hold the drop forward on. And again, you're going to want to make sure that these are pretty tight. And you could use Loctite on these as well, but that's totally up to you. I've found that if you just tighten these up pretty good, they should stay in place. The last thing that we need to do to our gun is reinstall the bolt and hammer assembly. But before you do this, you want to make sure that you've serviced your hammer correctly. This entails wiping it down with a paper towel to remove any dirt or debris that might be on the hammer, as well as inspecting the hammer O-ring for any nicks or cuts. If your O-ring looks in good shape, you can just take some paintball gun oil and apply a few drops of oil to the hammer O-ring. This is the most crucial O-ring in the entire gun. It's this O-ring that causes the gun to recock. While you're oiling that O-ring, you can just spread the oil around to the rest of the body of the hammer. It's going to make the hammer move more freely inside the gun. The last thing you want to look at is the back edge of the hammer where it catches on the sear. If this edge is rounded in any way, the gun could misfire. If it looks in good shape, we're ready to rebuild the hammer and bolt assembly. To do this correctly, you can just set your hammer down, reinstall your main spring into the back of the hammer, then put your bumper O-ring around the main spring, put your spring guide back into the spring, take your velocity adjuster and the flat disc that goes in the velocity adjuster and just drop that down in. Put that onto the back of the main spring, and then bring your bolt in and connect that in the hole in the top of the hammer. Now you're ready to install it back into your gun. Now we can reinstall the bolt and hammer assembly back into the gun. And again, I just like to pinch the hammer and bolt together. Makes it easier to hold everything together as one unit. And you'll push it in and you'll notice that the hammer assembly stops. And that's because the front of the hammer is catching on the back of the sear. If you're using a non-electronic version of a Spider or any type of blowback gun, you can typically just pull the trigger and everything will go back into the gun. On the electronic versions, you may need to push on what's called the sear release. On an Icon, there's a cut on the side of the grip frame, and you can just use an Allen key to push forward on the solenoid, and that will allow everything to go back into the gun. If you're using a Piranha, they actually have a sear release button, and that will allow you, if you push on that button, it'll allow you to put all the internals back into the gun. If for some reason you can't get your internals back into the gun, you may need to remove the grip frame again and put everything in and then reattach the grip frame. Once you have all the internals back into the gun, you can reinstall the bolt retaining pin back through the gun, flip it over, and reinstall the cotter pin back into the gun. The last thing that you need to do is reinstall the barrel. You can put a barrel cover on and install your tank. And what we're going to do is just check to make sure the gun is working properly. Seems to be working. In the next section, we'll go over basic troubleshooting. The most common problem with any spider type marker is that it won't recock. This problem plagues all blowback style markers. To fix it, the first thing you should do is clean and lubricate the hammer and bolt assembly. If this doesn't fix the problem, try replacing the hammer O-ring. This is the O-ring that commonly goes bad and will cause recocking issues. As you replace it, make sure you lubricate it as well as the hammer. Also make sure you're using the correct O-ring on the hammer. I've seen many people try to use a tank O-ring as their hammer O-ring. If you can't tell, this won't work. Most guns come with an extra hammer O-ring. On spiders, the hammer O-ring is typically red, and on piranhas, the hammer O-ring is typically blue. If you're trying to use the wrong O-ring, the gun probably won't work. If after replacing the hammer O-ring, the gun's still not recocking, you may need to replace the main spring. This is the spring that's located behind the hammer. This spring pushes the hammer and bolt assembly forward, striking the valve. If it's too weak, then the hammer's not hitting the valve hard enough to release enough air to push the hammer back to recock. To correct this, you replace the main spring with a stiffer, longer spring. You'll probably find that this corrects the problem. The most common internal leak is either from the cup seal itself or from the two O-rings that are on the valve body. If you have a leak coming from inside the gun, the first and easiest potential part to replace is the cup seal. If that doesn't work, try replacing one or both of the O-rings on the valve body. If you have your gun cocked and it's leaking from inside the gun, it's probably one of these parts that's causing the problem. Another common place for these guns to leak is from the O-rings on the ASA adapter as well as the O-ring on the low pressure chamber. You can test to see if these O-rings are bad by airing up the gun and spraying Windex or soap and water on the area where you hear the leak. Typically you'll see air bubbles coming up from the leak. On many of the electronic trigger frames, you'll notice that you have a lot of extra movement in the trigger. On some models, there's a screw located at the top of the trigger that allows you to reduce the extra travel. To see if your gun has this option, just remove the trigger frame and look at the top of the trigger to see if it has a set screw there. The idea behind this set screw is that it hits up against the bottom of the body of the gun and pushes the trigger backwards closer to the microswitch that activates the gun. Doing this correctly takes trial and error. All you need to do is slowly turn the adjusting screw counterclockwise a few turns and then try fitting the grip frame back up to the gun. You need to press the trigger frame up tightly against the bottom of the gun to get an accurate reading. Once you have it in position, look to see where the trigger is now located. Depending on how much you adjusted the set screw, you'll probably need to adjust it a few more times to fine-tune the setting. Once you have it exactly how you want it, reconnect the trigger frame to the body and retest to see if the microswitch is being fully pressed and released between each trigger pull. Now that's a nice trigger pull. The first upgrade that I would do to your gun is a barrel. The barrel that comes stock on most guns is just meant to be good enough to get you out into the field. They're typically not ported or polished very well because most manufacturers know that you're going to buy a new barrel anyways. There are a few different types of barrels out there. First, you have your typical one-piece barrel. The typical size for these barrels is 14 inches. They range in price anywhere from $25 up to $50. All of the barrels at this price range perform about the same. When you're shopping for this level of barrel, you really want to examine the polish on the inside of the barrel as well as the porting or the holes on the outside of the barrel. The better the internal polish and the better the porting, the better the barrel will shoot. The next type of barrel that I have here is a 16-inch internally rifled barrel. In the past, I've used an internally rifled barrel, and it's worked well for me. I felt like I got a little bit of extra distance out of the rifling. However, I felt it was very sensitive to paint. If the paint was a little brittle, or perhaps even a little big for the bore of the barrel, it would break paint. The extra length on any barrel helps quiet the gun. Many people think that the longer the barrel, the more accuracy and distance that you'll get. That's totally wrong. We're dealing with paintballs, not bullets. The longer the barrel, the more air it takes to get the ball out of the barrel. I tell people that the longer the barrel, the quieter the gun will be. Increased accuracy comes from a good inner polish and porting, as well as a good paint-to-barrel match. Internally rifled barrels typically cost about $75. The best type of barrel that you can get is some type of two-pieced barrel. Two-piece barrels are exactly that. They are a barrel that has a front piece and a back piece. Many times you can take them apart and change the bore size on the back or change out the length of the tip. Two-piece barrels are different from one-piece barrels because the ball only touches the barrel in the back part. This is because the internal bore size of the tip is significantly larger than that of the back. The extra room in the tip along with the porting allows the back pressure behind the ball to be released. This gently releases the ball into the air. Two-piece barrels are generally thought of as being the most accurate barrels available. There are many different companies making two-piece barrels. I suggest you do some research and find the one with the best polish and porting that fits your budget. One upgrade that I think many people overlook or just don't put enough value on is converting from CO2 to a high-pressure air system. High-pressure air tanks, commonly called nitrogen tanks, greatly increase the performance of any marker. First, it increases accuracy and just makes the gun perform better all around. If you play in colder winter conditions, it's the only way to go because it's not really affected by the outside air temperature. I strongly suggest that one of your very first upgrades is that you get a high-pressure air tank. It will make all the other upgrades work that much better. One upgrade that many people consider is a new bolt. A new bolt is a great upgrade for a blowback gun. The lighter the bolt you can find, the less kick your gun will have with each shot. The less kick you have, the more accuracy you'll have out in the field. And this is because the gun won't be shaking around as much as you fire. It's also a good idea to find a bolt that has O-rings. These O-rings ensure that all the air coming up from the valve hits the back of the ball, hence making your gun more consistent and more efficient. Another popular upgrade is a new valve. There are many different aftermarket valves you can use. The point of a new valve is to allow increased airflow to the ball. This means you can lower your gun's operating pressure. Typically, blowback guns operate somewhere between 600 and 800 psi. With a new valve, you can sometimes lower that 100 psi and still shoot 300 feet per second. This reduction in pressure is good because you'll be using less air with each shot, and the pressure that you're blasting each ball with will be less. This in turn means you'll be breaking less paint in the gun. Another nice part is a new ASA adapter like the one I have here. You'll see that it has a built-in low pressure chamber as well as a pressure gauge. This is a nice upgrade because it increases the volume of air in the valve, which means you can lower your operating pressure even more. Not only that, you can actually see what your operating pressure is. Knowing the pressure in the valve is nice because if you have a problem with the gun, you can actually see if the operating pressure is correct. Many problems come from the gun not getting enough air. This gauge will allow you to easily check to see if the air supply is causing any of the issues you're experiencing. If you're interested in reducing the kick of the gun even further, you may consider a new hammer. An aftermarket hammer is typically lighter than a stock hammer. This means you'll have less mass moving inside the gun, and again, less mass means less kick. Less kick means more accuracy. The most common problem that people experience with blowback markers is that the gun won't recock. This is because it's really the only thing that can go wrong other than an air leak. The important thing to note is that there are only a few reasons why your gun won't recock. The most common reason is a lack of oil on the hammer and bolt. This lack of lubrication affects the entire cycle of the gun. First, it slows down the velocity of the hammer and bolt as they travel forward due to the added friction inside the gun. This added friction and slowing of the hammer does two things. It decreases the velocity of the ball being fired because the hammer didn't strike the valve as hard as it should have, and it makes it so the gun doesn't have enough pressure to recock. You'll notice in the animation that as the hammer hits the valve, most of the air goes up through the valve to fire the ball, but some goes back through the valve to recock the gun. If the valve doesn't release enough air, the gun won't recock. With that being said, again, it's crucial to keep your hammer O-rings, bolt, and bolt O-rings well lubricated. I recommend using paintball gun oil, not grease, to do this. Oil is less viscous and allows the parts to move more freely. It also allows the O-rings to create the necessary seal. Because oiling these parts is so easy and really takes so little time to do, you should get in the habit of oiling your internals every time you use the gun. This will just ensure that your gun always works, as well as extend the life of your hammer and bolt O-rings. Remember this, when your hammer O-ring is dry, it wears out due to the added friction inside the gun. Plus, it doesn't create a good seal, so the gun won't recock. It's because of this fact that your hammer and bolt O-rings need to be oiled at all times. Other than added friction slowing down the hammer and bolt, what other part could cause the hammer and bolt not to move forward fast enough to hit the valve? It's the main spring. If the main spring is too weak, the hammer won't hit the valve hard enough, regardless of how much oil you use, and you won't release enough air to recock the gun. It's because of this that some manufacturers are putting extra springs in the parts kits that come with the gun. So, if your gun is not recocking, first try lubricating the hammer and bolt. If that doesn't work, try replacing either the hammer O-ring or the main spring. In some cases, you may need to replace both of these parts. 99% of the time, replacing the hammer O-ring and the main spring will fix any recocking problems. In some situations, it won't. If this is the case, you may need to replace other parts. Before you go out and start blindly buying new parts, like a sear or cup seal, try rebuilding and cleaning the gun a few more times. You may find that you installed something incorrectly the last time, and it could save you some money at the pro shop. If in the end you still can't get your gun to work, take it to your local pro shop, and I'm sure they'll be happy to help you figure out exactly what's wrong with your marker. Well, that concludes our video on the Blowback style marker. For more information on other products we produce, go to TechTpaintball.com. Until the next time, keep shooting.